Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 3rd of July, and today we're going to be talking about the front line, but we're also going to be discussing the situation regarding the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant very briefly. I do intend to do a full video about the entire saga over there at a later date, but for now we're just going to talk about the most important parts and also talking about the entire Kakhovka reservoir in the Zaporizhzhia region and some potential Ukrainian activities around the reservoir now that it's dried up. We're going to discuss all of that. Let's begin by looking at the Zaporizhzhia front, where I yet again have to talk about Pyatikhatki. We've been talking about it basically in every single video now, with the gist of the situation being that the 128th Mountain Assault Brigade has yet again attacked in the direction of this town. Look, the Russians don't control it, but the Ukrainians do not have a solid control over this town either. And so today they tried sending in some of their assault detachments to try to take over the town yet again, but they were repulsed by the Russian artillery and aviation. Again, let me remind you guys that this entire area over here, this entire valley, which spans from like Lobkove to Pyatikhatki, which is about a 3-mile stretch of land that Ukrainians are trying to solidify control over, it's all on a valley in comparison to the heights that the Russians control further to the south and to the west and to the east in all directions. And so it's very difficult to hold on to positions over there in this general box over here. And so that's why we're hearing of all of these failed Ukrainian assaults in that direction. The Ukrainians have also yet again launched assaults in the direction of Robotyne. We talked about how previously the Ukrainians were able to advance about 150 meters towards Robotyne in this region over here. I'll mark it with this box over here. This is generally where the fighting occurred, and the Ukrainians at most took over like a very small area with this entire tree line in this general direction. The specific distance is very hard to measure. The 150-meter number is just an estimate, but now we know that the 1430th Regiment of the Russian forces was able to reverse the Ukrainian gains in this area and took back all of the Ukrainian positions, including the forest belt that the Ukrainians had taken over yesterday in their assaults. So that would be this area. The Russians reestablished control over this general square over here. It's hard to pinpoint exactly where, but there are different trench lines adjacent to these bush lines where the Russians have been able to secure control again. And we know that the Ukrainians were trying to attack in the direction of Robotyne through these forests, and these forests that I'm talking about run through here. It gives you cover as you try to advance into the town of Robotyne from the north. And you can see the distance from the Ukrainian lines to Robotyne at the moment is about 1.6 miles, maybe 1.8, around that amount. So it's not too far away, but it's just that the Russians do have a lot of positions in these bush lines as well. And they also have control of the heights overlooking some of the valleys and fields that the Ukrainians have under their control, which is making it harder for the Ukrainians to actually take a step towards Robotyne, which is why you're seeing all of these issues. So now the Ukrainians, they have begun evacuating their wounded and their killed from the battlefield around Robotyne and to the north of it. And so they're using their armored vehicles, and that's where the evacuations are taking place, being transported using these vehicles. With vehicles, they are trying to use the forest belts as concealment from the Russian artillery as they make their way to the front line and then back all the way to like Novosilka or all the way to Orkiv in order to treat the wounded and bury the dead. And so let's move on to the most interesting part of the Zaporizhzhia / Donetsk front today, which is the Velyka Novosilka axis. And in this direction, we do have reports that the Ukrainians conducted some troop rotations and they beefed up the manpower of certain units on the front line, specifically around the town of Levadne. So in this general region, the 31st and the 36th brigades, they were given additional reinforcements that were moved to the front line around this town. 31st Brigade, this is the 31st Brigade, and then 36th, if I can find it over here for you guys, it's this unit over here, 36th Marine Brigade. And so they're also have some of their units located around the Vladne. Some of them are obviously in different parts of the front line, but they have been sent to here, and they're trying to fortify some of their forward positions that are to the southeast of Levadne. So, in the about 1 mile span in between the line of contact in the town of Levadne, where you do have some of these forest lines. There's also a cemetery. So in that area, the Ukrainians are beefing up their fortifications and trying to set up strongholds so then they could eventually push in the direction of Pryutyne. I've been talking about that for a while because that's a big part of Ukraine's plans going forward with the counteroffensive. And so in this area, we also have reports that the 72nd Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, which is located in Vuhledar, they moved over one of their artillery battalions in the direction of generally the Velyka Novosilka axis in the Russian salient. And so what this indicates to us is that the Ukrainians are preparing for an increase in artillery barrages in the direction of Russian positions around Pryutyne. And so that's why they're moving in the 72nd Brigade. And that will aid in Ukrainian advances from their current lines to Pryutyne. And from Levadne, the distance is about 2 miles until Pryutyne. It's not that big of a distance, and it's certainly within the range of, shorter range shelling and mortars, for instance, from basically all directions. But let's move to a different axis of attack in this region. So the Ukrainians did not actually conduct any offensive operations in the direction of Storomayorsk today. They mainly just worked on fortifying their own positions and evacuating the killed and the wounded who were sent with their armored vehicles back to Velyka Novosilka, where they probably originally congregated, and now they're being treated or buried. And so the Ukrainians, they did try to beef up some of their defenses around the forest belts to the northwest of Storomayorsk, because a lot of those were targeted in Russian artillery and airstrikes in recent days. And so the squares that I'm going over right now, that's generally where Russia hits. There are some key Ukrainian positions that have been established over the past few weeks that are allowing them to set up forward firing positions and sometimes sleep in those areas. So then they could eventually begin to probe into the town of Storomayorsk itself. And so a lot of those positions have been weakened today due to Russian artillery and aviation strikes. And so now the Ukrainians are trying to rebuild some of that. And the units that were targeted in these Russian strikes include the 35th Marine Brigade, which we have over here, and the 128th Territorial Defense Brigade, which is located over here. I added in a whole bunch of units today, and I tried to be as accurate as I could with their locations. Obviously, not all units are monolithic in their location. They're sometimes spread out, which is why I try to not just include brigades, but also battalions wherever I know they're located. And also, I added in a whole bunch of drone units, not just in Velyka Novosilka, but in Orikhiv, Kherson, Piatikatki, that entire area. So give it a look if you're interested in seeing the units. But anyway, let's move on. So the Ukrainians, they also moved some of the assault detachments of the 35th Brigade to the front line around these fortified positions that I was talking about before. And they also moved in their armored vehicles 2 crews of Javelin ATGMs. And they also moved men from the 110th Territorial Defense Brigade, which is the unit over here. 110th Territorial Defense Battalion, actually. My bad. And so that's really in terms of Zaporizhzhia. We still don't have any sort of major Ukrainian movement, but there's a lot of rumors about a change due to the NATO summit that's going to be occurring from the 11th to the 12th of July. And so we're going to get into that and how it relates to the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant right now. So really for a year now, we've been hearing about the entire situation regarding the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. And there's already been a year of cross-river shelling and claims that one side or the other has been trying to conduct false flag attacks to destroy the power plant. But the situation never really reached a crisis where the plant was actually targeted and exploded. The Ukrainians certainly have launched certain M777 shells, using M777s, firing shells in the direction of an air radar. And they've also sent kamikaze drones in this direction, but it's never been enough to cause any sort of catastrophic explosion in the power plant. But recently, we've been hearing more and more rhetoric surrounding this power plant. And we heard actually from Zelensky this weekend that he said there's a very serious threat of an explosion there. And he said that Russia is ready to provoke an explosion at the plant. And he says that he's talking to other countries that he's allied with about putting political pressure on Russia in order to prevent them from engaging in such an attempt. And so that's sort of a shift because we didn't hear much about the power plant for really months now, and now we're starting to hear about it again, especially after the explosion at the Kakhovka Dam, which lowered the water levels of the entire reservoir, the Kakhovka Reservoir over here, which could potentially threaten the cooling levels. It's not really reached any sort of tipping point or any sort of major crisis just yet, but I will go into more detail about all of that in a future video. But anyway, in terms of the political crisis, we actually have news from last week that the Ukrainian State Emergency Service conducted radioactive safety drills in the region of Zaporizhzhia that they have under their control. And in addition, previously, Ukrainian intelligence officials said that Russia would blow up the artificial pond that is needed for cooling the nuclear reactors at the power plant. And so that artificial pool is over here. From the satellite imagery that I've seen after the explosion of the dam, it seems like the water levels here are not really affected, despite the surrounding regions having a huge decrease in their water levels. And so, in terms of the cooling, that's fine for the moment. But nonetheless, there is a big fear from the Ukrainian side. I'm seeing that the area would be mined and that it could cause some sort of either explosion on accident or that it would be intentional by the Russians as sort of a false flag attack to blame the Ukrainians. But we have reports from the International Atomic Energy Agency, which has been permitted by the Russians to inspect parts of the power plant, including parts of the pond, and they have said that there is no indication of mining in those areas that they've been allowed to see. Although restricted areas, who knows what's going on in there. There may be safety reasons for Russia does not want to show those areas, but that still leaves the door open for questioning. And I also want to give the Russian perspective. So meanwhile, Russian sources have been claiming that the Ukrainians will conduct a provocation on the power plant from around July 5th to July 9th. That's the frame of when this will occur. And that would be in order to trigger Western involvement in the war, because this would be seen as a major escalation by NATO. And this would happen in lieu of the NATO summit, which is supposed to be occurring in Lithuania from the 11th to the 12th. And so that would become the main topic of discussion at the conference. In essence, how to respond to this alleged Russian attack. So that's what the Russians are saying. And they're also saying that this would be in preparation for a Ukrainian operation across the Dnieper River, across the Kakhovka Reservoir, which would include crossing it with an amphibious assault, and that the explosion at the power plant would sort of take the Russians off guard, and then they would be able to cross the river and begin a counteroffensive, crossing through, Zaporizhzhia Oblast and flanking the Russian fortifications to the east. That's the theory that I've seen on Russian Telegram. I want to make sure that people are not misconstruing this and saying that it's Russian official spokespersons, but there was a statement from the Russian foreign minister's spokesperson where she was basically blaming Ukrainians and saying that they are planning some sort of provocation. So that part is actually stated by official Russian government sources. They didn't say anything about this D-Day sort of scenario crossing the Dnieper River. Now, in terms of Ukraine actually crossing over the Dnieper River, I have a very interesting Twitter post I made a few days ago looking at the water levels in the Kakhovka Reservoir and talking about how realistic would it be for the Ukrainians to even try to cross over this area. So here's a satellite image of the before and after of the dam explosion, and you can see how really the true nature of the Dnieper River is revealed as the reservoir dries up. And so technically, you could have infantry cross over the now dried up desert sort of area, which was formerly known as the reservoir, and cross into Zaporizhzhia Oblast from there. That's certainly a possibility, but I'm going to get into why I find this to be very unrealistic. But first, look at this. This is how it looks on the ground. Look at all the cracks in the ground. It's very difficult for heavy loaded vehicles to cross through here. And let's say for a second, if they did, imagine if they did just try to cross through here all the way to the Russian positions in like Enerhodar, for instance. It's completely open over here. There's zero cover. No trees, no nothing, no trench. Everything is open, and they'd also have to cross through the river, so that would take longer. They can't just like speed through the open area. They'd have to cross through the river. This would be totally a field day for the Russian Air Force and for the artillery. there would be nothing stopping them from completely bombarding the Ukrainians. But there's also the possibility that the ground under this entire former reservoir would actually crumble due to the heavy load from the vehicles that would be going at fast speeds. So they may not even be able to support such a high load of armored vehicles, which would be required for a fast offensive across the river. So I don't see that as likely, but here's just like some arrows of how it would look like. I do think though that a more realistic scenario would be if the Ukrainians just like made a minor incursion through the what I would call the deserts or the former reservoir territory. Over here, like you can see where my arrows are located, maybe they would try to flank the Russian positions in a place like Vershina, which is a town over here, or in Luhove, where you have like all these fortifications, but it would be a pretty minor incursion. So it could potentially be pulled off if they conduct it fast enough. But even then, they would be obviously targeted by Russian artillery. Look at the distances across the river. So from Nikopol to Enerhadar, it's like 4 miles of having to drive through the open area and crossing the river as well. Over here, at its one of its most wide points, it would be 12 miles. Let's say the Ukrainians just did like a small scale crossing of the desert area from, I don't know, Klavny all the way to Vershina. That's like 5 miles. So you could see they'd have to traverse that 5 miles totally on their own. They'd be totally exposed. And I get that they'd be able to go through there pretty quickly, but you'd have Russian forces fortified in the trenches, ready for those forces to reach them. And they'd have a pretty good field of vision as the Ukrainians were approaching them. They'd have a good sight, and the Ukrainian forces would be on the lower elevation compared to the Russian positions because all of the water level that dried up, and so they'd be fired upon very easily from the ground and from above. I just find the entire thing pretty impractical. So that's my take on the entire situation. So I don't see Ukraine going through that. If they did, it would be catastrophic for them. So yeah, that's really the situation there. Let's go on to the Luhansk front, where we don't have much news, but we do know that some small Ukrainian groups, some small assault groups have been trying to infiltrate the town of Dibrova. Dibrova, for reference, is about 1.5, maybe even less, 1.1 miles away from the line of contact. It's very close, but what's in between the line of contact in Dibrova is just pure forest, very dense tree area. And so Ukrainian groups, they've been going under the cover of this dense forested area, trying to infiltrate into the town. And they have failed so far due to the spotting of these assault groups by UAV crews of the Russian forces in this area. And then once those like Orlan reconnaissance drones, for instance, they notice this group advancing, they contact the batteries of the 128th Artillery Brigade, and they've been targeting some of these Ukrainians in pretty accurate strikes, enough accuracy to push them back. So in this general region, we know that not one side has been really gearing up for any sort of major offensive activity just yet. But we do know that the Ukrainians are trying to move in reinforcements into this direction. The Ukrainians certainly do have the better manpower in this specific sector, and their units may actually be better equipped in some regards, especially the ones that are moving in now from NATO training that have been recently formed this year and have now been sent to the front line. Just as one example, you have the 44th Mechanized Brigade, which is a new unit which has, to my recollection, never seen combat before. They're being moved from their positions in Chernihiv, where they went through basic training and received Polish weaponry, and now they're in Svyatogorsk and in Liman. Svyatogorsk, where is that? Over here. It's over here. And then also in Liman. And so they're being moved to the front line, either for offensive purposes in the future or just to hold the current line to prevent a future Russian attack. And so that's all I have for today. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.